What is up, guys? Today I'd love to share with you 3 simple tips to play any standard middle game position effectively, such as this one arising from the Italian game. So, both sides have developed their minor pieces, castle, played all the standard moves. What are you gonna do next? These type of positions are a challenge for most chess players. Well, at this point, maybe you also realize that you need to develop your bishop somehow. So let's say we're gonna add a few more moves to the game. Let's say your opponent does something, and now you're at the crossroad. So how would you play here as white? Think about this for a second. There are plenty of moves that make some sense. You may decide to occupy the center by pushing this pawn forward. Or maybe you want to secure this bishop from all sorts of attack of black and you want to play like pawn a3 or pawn a4. Maybe you want to centralize your knight, or move your king, or queen, or reroute the knight to some better square. There are plenty of opportunities and they all look more or less correct. So how do you choose the one? Here's the first tip. Develop your heavy pieces. And don't worry, I'll explain that in a second. And I use that tip as a grandmaster, but it's really easy to replicate it for anyone. So here's the deal. Think about this. In an opening, you develop your minor pieces, and that's great. That is correct. But at the very same time, you also have your heavy pieces, such as your queen. That is equal in terms of the value to 3 minor pieces, and your queen so far is doing nothing. Therefore, having your queen standing right here on d1 is sort of equal to having 3 minor pieces standing somewhere on the first row doing nothing. Definitely that's something you need to care about. And of course, other moves such as d4 or knight to d5, they all make sense, but they improve your position marginally, while bringing your queen into the attack would increase your attacking capacity significantly. So what do you do about your heavy pieces, your queen and rooks? Well, you look for ways to provide them more scope of activity so that they control greater quantity of squares and they have an opportunity, at least potentially, to attack something. So let's talk about this queen, for example. Because as for the rook on a1, definitely would wish to bring it into play, but there is no opportunity currently because the queen is blocking the way. This rook on f1 is not too active at the moment, but at least it has this potential semi-open file, therefore it has some potential. So the queen is the one that is also doing nothing. So you could move the queen somewhere here, and that would be a perfectly fine move to play. One of the good moves, at least it's better compared to where it's starting. But anyway, from here it's still not doing too much. So is there a way to bring your queen out in a more active way, where it has an opportunity in the future down the line to attack anything? Well, the move that I like here would be potentially to reroute the queen somewhere along this diagonal to h4 or g3 towards the king side, so that you can then attack your opponent's king. So your opponent will play something, let's say they decide to go after your bishop, they often do, or they do any other move, doesn't really matter. You can now bring your queen out, and now you already start putting some pressure onto your opponent. Of course, it's nothing serious at this point, but nevertheless, you are at least preparing future attack. Say your opponent decides to finally grab your juicy bishop and then develops the bishop of their own. What do you do next? Well, now your queen is more or less active. It's at least opposite to your opponent's king. Now it's time to bring your rooks into play. And you can do that, for example, by going knight to h4, which would open up this file for your rook, and at the same time the knight is ready to join the party and together with the queen to create some checkmating threats. Also, your rook is now really active. For instance, if your opponent is careless and plays something like this, you can strike with this rook straight away with rook takes f6. Notice that the pawn is pinned, therefore he can't recapture, and you'll probably win the game quickly. Now, even if your opponent does not blunder that and plays something else, let's say king to h7, and you can't win the game straight away, nevertheless, you can ask yourself the same question. How do I bring my heavy pieces into play, my queen and rooks? Your queen is already active, this rook is already active. How about this one on a1 in the corner? Still doing nothing. Is there any way for you to bring it to a more active square? Well, since you're attacking on the king side, I'd probably play something like this and then stack rooks along the f file and keep putting pressure right there. In the future, maybe the knight will join the party. And as you can see in general, as soon as you brought your heavy pieces into the attack, that made it so much more effective. This time you'll be playing like Fischer, or maybe better, who knows. It is white to play, Fischer's playing white against Benko, and now let's apply this knowledge. Again, the position is totally different, but nevertheless it's just the beginning of the middle game stage. So what do you need to do here? Improve your heavy pieces, meaning your queen and rooks. So what are the moves that you might consider here? Well, one of them could be bringing this rook into play, such as playing rook to d1, putting it to this open file. And that would be a great move. In fact, computer loves it the most, so one of the great moves to play. Now, in the game Fischer played queen g3, which also makes sense. This relocates the queen to a better position, potentially attacking the opponent's king. White is getting ready to play bishop h6 or something like this, but in addition to this, White also sidesteps the rook so that the rook is now also active along this f file. Therefore, with one move, we're just hitting two birds with one queen. Alright, Black decided to play king h8 so that, the queen does not x-ray the king. But Fischer keeps playing queen g4. He basically pursues the same idea. He wants to activate the queen and bring it to a more active square. And once Black played c6 to control this square, potentially so that White can't jump there, Fischer played queen h5, relocating the queen once again opposite to the opponent's king. And Black played queen e8, quite an interesting move. But nevertheless, now White already has quite significant attacking potential. There is this queen opposite to the king, there is the rook along this file, and also potentially this dark square bishop is getting ready to be involved into the attack. Fischer traded off this bishop because it allowed him on the next move possibly to play this move pawn e5. But there is a little but important note here. If Fischer played e5 straight away, that looks winning, as that opens up this checkmating threat to the pawn on h7. However, his opponent, Benko, who's also a grandmaster, prepared a really brilliant counter-strike with the move pawn to f5, opening up this opposition of queens, offering the queen trade. In addition to this, this knight is hanging, this pawn on e5 is hanging, and finally he blocked the diagonal for the bishop. In fact, in this position, Black would be just perfectly fine. But Fischer decided to shut it down with a brilliant move. Hey, don't judge a rook by its cover. He played rook to f6 to blockade the position entirely, so that once the rook is accepted, now this f pawn is blocked, and after e5, Black has nothing to do to stop this checkmating threat. This gradually brings us to the second tip, which we'll talk about in this game. Currently it was Black to play, and initially he just followed the first tip, bringing your heavy pieces into play. He played rook to e8, bringing this least active piece into play to a more active position. White responded with pawn to f3, potentially I guess he was worried about bishop g4 or stuff like that, and he played queen g5 at this point. Now, once you brought your heavyweights into play, you can actually say that your development is now complete, because every piece that you have is now active, and that is the goal that you should have by the end of the opening or early middle game stage. But this still brings us to the next question. White played knight c3, getting ready to bring the knight somewhere here or here to the center of the board. What do you do then? Well, then you need to attack. All your pieces are already active, and therefore it is time to use them. You use them to attack your opponent. How do you do that specifically? Well, you ask yourself, how do I move my pieces forward and create threats onto my opponent's half of the board? That is the question that you ask yourself, and it allows you to find those moves. Initially, Black played queen h5, creating a pretty straightforward threat. Queen takes h2. White decided to stop that by going bishop h1, which includes the queen into the defense. And how do you play here? Well, in general, you still ask yourself the very same question. How can I move forward, hopefully onto my opponent's side of the board, and attack somehow? So the one move that comes to mind would be bishop to h3, hitting this rook on f1, and that would definitely be a good move for Black to play. But in the game, he found an even stronger move, knight takes c4. And at first, moves like that seem like coming totally out of nowhere and it being a shocking sacrifice. But you see that in reality, you notice them by following this way of thinking. How do I go forward onto my opponent's side of the board and take or attack something? And once this knight was captured, Black then can sacrifice the rook right here on e3. His idea is just to deflect White queen from the defense of that square h2, and White has nothing to do, because after this trade, this is a check to the king, and after White defends, anyhow captures the bishop, for example, there is queen to h2, and Black wins. This time the situation is completely different. It is White to play, but we're gonna apply the exact same way of thinking. By the way, this is the game of my student, therefore I can kind of guess exactly how he could come up with those moves, and we're gonna try to replicate these together. Therefore, we know that in the early middle game stage, there are two keys that we know so far that you need to apply. One of them is activating your heavy pieces, and having this idea in mind, you could play something like rook to c1 or maybe queen e2 followed by rook to d1, and these would be great ideas. However, in addition to that, we also now know the second tip, which is to attack, to move towards your opponent's half of the board and create threats. And if those opportunities are available, they're usually the strongest because they're the most annoying for your opponent. With that in mind, white played knight to e5. This attacks this knight on c6, plus opens up this bishop, which x-rays a bunch of black's pieces along this long diagonal. Black decided to solidify by going queen to c7, and I'm pretty sure a lot of players would simply trade off pieces on c6. But white played a much more interesting move, knight to d7. Going deep into opponent's position, threatening rook, threatening this bishop on c5. And you see that at first, that move is probably not the one that you consider. However, you can find it if you ask yourself, how do I go forward onto my opponent's side of the board and create threats? Nonetheless, knight d7 looks reckless, because black could play rook to d8, and he did, pinning the knight, threatening to win it on the next move. So what do you do next? Well, you keep attacking, move forward, create threats, and white played queen to g4, threatening this checkmate on g7, and all of a sudden white is actually winning the game, just within a couple moves. Because this threat is really strong, and even the knight from d7 is sort of participating into the attack. Because if black were to play pawn to f6 or something like this, then white can go ahead and take it. In the game, however, black came up with a very creative defense. Black played bishop to d4. Very unusual move, but it makes a lot of sense. He actually wants to trade off or block the diagonal for this dark square bishop, and black is not down a piece after that because he's going to get back this knight on d7. But white came up with a counter trick, following the very same way of thinking. Instead of calculating all these super complex variations, white needs to ask himself, how do I go forward onto my opponent's side of the board and create threats, forcing moves? White played knight to f6 check, and that is a simple and elegant solution to this problem. This is a check. What can black do now? He can't take it with the pawn because the pawn is pinned. And if it's captured by the bishop, then after bishop to f6, white just continues the attack. It attacks the rook. Even more importantly, it attacks the king, threatening checkmate. After g6, white can either grab the rook or just go after this checkmate, which is even stronger, and white wins. By the way, now we're moving on to the third tip, but if you want to hone your attacking skills so that you learn and practice the ability to find such attacking moves on your own, you can go to my free masterclass by clicking the link in the description below the video. At this point, you may be wondering, Igor, it's all good, I'd love to attack, but what if there are no attacking moves? In this position from the game between Rubinstein and Schlechter, it was white to move, and if you ask yourself, how do I go forward and create threats? Well, there are not that many opportunities actually. You could possibly push this pawn forward, attacking the knight, but the knight has a really great square to be moved to, the square on d5, and black is absolutely fine. Therefore, e5 does not really challenge black. So what could you do in this situation? Well, if you wish to attack, but the position is blocked, the solution oftentimes is to open the position first. And opening the position in reality usually implies opening the position in the middle of the board. With that being said, Rubinstein played pawn d5, which is indeed a great move in the position. At first, it seems like just an offer of an exchange of a couple of pawns. But let's look at the change. Once these central pawns are traded, just look at the change in the position. The white bishop is now able to attack this pawn on b7, as well as the rook down the line. Our rook from d1 is now x-raying the queen, making it possible to play something like bishop takes f7 check, and then grab his queen. Our bishop from f4 is also very active along these diagonals, and all in all, our position became so much more aggressive just after a trade of a few pawns. So that is how opening up the position could open up so many new opportunities. And if black tries to remove the queen from this danger and goes and play queen to b6, then you can start using your usual way of thinking to find attacking moves. You ask yourself, how do I go forward, and create threats. And if you ask yourself that question, you'll find plenty of opportunities. There's bishop takes b7, because the bishop is supported by the queen. This would also hit the rook on a8. That is a nice opportunity. Even stronger is the other move on opponent's side of the board, bishop to c7. It in fact simply clears the f-file for your queen so that now you can play queen takes f7 and it's game over. While in most cases you open up the position by trading off pawns, sometimes you can do that with the help of a sacrifice. In this situation, white is heading development and you'd wish to attack, but there is no easy way to do that, because if you try to jump with your knight forward, that's not really the case because your pawn will simply go ahead and capture it. So what do? Well, you could simply try to bring your queen out and, put the rook to the central file. Again, that would be a nice and perfect solution. However, there is also a more aggressive way to handle the situation. It's to move knight takes e5. This time, white blows up the position with help of a sacrifice, and after black takes it, there's a move knight to d5, which opens up this discovered attack. But wait a second, what if black simply captures this bishop? Well, that leads to this sneaky checkmate with a knight. In the actual game, black noticed the danger and just retreated the queen, but now after this trade and bishop to a3 checking the king needs to move, and can you see the winning move for right here? It's really interesting, because instead of trying to attack the king, all of a sudden you change the target, and you go bishop d6, this time you're hitting the queen, and black has to lose material and lose the game. By the way, this is also a game of my student. Recently I recorded a video showing how he became a FIDE master without even having time really to study chess. So if you're curious, check it out right here, and I'll see you on the inside.